Sometimes, the difference between an ordinary night and one you'll never forget is just a few degrees in wind direction and a decision that needs to be made in a matter of seconds. This is the story of one of those nights that completely changed my perspective on what it means to be responsible for 165 lives at 37,000 feet, where every choice could be the difference between making it home or becoming tomorrow's headline. My name is Captain Michael Anderson. I'm 48 years old and I've been a captain for 15 years, flying commercial aircraft for over 2 decades. When people ask me about my profession, I usually tell them that 99% of the time it's absolute routine, but it's that remaining 1% that defines an entire career. That Tuesday night in November, I would discover exactly what that means. It was my 3rd consecutive day of flying that week. I'd just returned from a sequence of international flights and was scheduled to make only 2 domestic flights before having 4 days off. My wife, Sarah, had called that morning reminding me that our daughter Emma, 8 years old, would have her first performance in the school choir on Thursday. "Daddy, you promised you'd be there," she had told me at breakfast, with that look only children can give when they want absolute certainty about something important. I arrived at the airport 2 hours before scheduled departure, as I always do. It's a habit I've developed over the years. I prefer to have time to review everything calmly rather than race against the clock. The morning weather briefing indicated favorable conditions for both flights of the day. Some scattered clouds, good visibility, winds within normal parameters. Nothing suggested this would be one of the most challenging nights of my career. The first officer assigned to the second flight was Jake Martinez, 29 years old, with about 2,500 total flight hours and only 400 hours as a first officer in commercial aviation. I'd flown with him 3 times before. Competent, studious, but still with that tension typical of someone starting their career with major airlines. During our pre-flight briefing, we meticulously reviewed the route, predicted weather conditions, alternate and emergency airports, and all standard and non-standard procedures that might be necessary. The aircraft was a Boeing 737-800, about 8 years old, with an excellent maintenance record and all systems functioning perfectly. During the pre-flight inspection, I walked around the aircraft checking every detail: tires, brakes, control surfaces, antennas, lights. It's a ritual I've performed religiously for 20 years, regardless of conditions or time pressure. As my first instructor always said, trust the mechanics but verify personally. Boarding began at 8:30 p.m. for a flight scheduled to depart at 9:15 p.m. We had 165 passengers that night, nearly full capacity. During my briefing with the lead flight attendant, Lisa, an experienced professional I'd worked with many times, she informed me about the passenger composition: some families with children, a group of executives returning from a medical conference, several regular passengers on the route, and some foreign tourists. We took off exactly on schedule. The takeoff was smooth without any issues. The aircraft was well balanced, engines responding perfectly, and within minutes we were at our cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. The city lights faded behind us, and soon we were flying over the ocean of darkness that is the American interior at night. Jake was visibly more relaxed now that we were in cruise flight. We discussed procedures, exchanged some stories from previous flights, and he told me about his career plans. "Captain, my dream is to someday fly international routes like you do," he said, while monitoring our instruments. "Patience," I replied. "Every flight is an opportunity to learn something new, even the most routine ones." The first 2.5 hours of flight went exactly as we expected. We maintained regular contact with air traffic control centers, reported our position as needed, and constantly monitored our systems. The passenger cabin was quiet. I could see through the security monitors that most people were sleeping, some reading, others watching the onboard entertainment systems. It was a typical red-eye flight, the kind every commercial pilot appreciates: efficient, on time, no surprises. The type of flight that allows you to get home on schedule, have dinner with the family, and get a good night's sleep before the next professional commitment. It was at 11:42 p.m., when we were approximately 280 kilometers from our destination, that our routine night began transforming into something completely different. The first sign that things wouldn't go according to plan came through the emergency frequency from the control center. "Attention all aircraft in the region," said a tense voice that immediately caught our attention. We have a frontal system moving much faster than initially predicted. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly throughout the entire approach corridor. Jake and I exchanged a look that said everything. In aviation, when air traffic control makes a general advisory like that, it's because the situation is becoming serious quickly. We immediately tuned to our destination's specific frequency to get more detailed information. What we heard wasn't encouraging. Several aircraft had already reported severe turbulence in the region, wind gusts exceeding 70 kilometers per hour, heavy rain with visibility reduced to less than 800 meters, and storm cells with significant electrical activity. What was even more concerning, this frontal system was moving at a speed about 60 kilometers per hour, faster than meteorologists had predicted that morning. "Center, this is the flight bound for the main airport," I communicated. "Request complete update on weather conditions at destination and at alternate and emergency airports." The response came a few seconds later, and it wasn't what we wanted to hear. "Flight, conditions at the destination airport are deteriorating rapidly. Current wind 90 degrees at 45 knots gusting to 75 knots, visibility 600 meters in heavy rain, cloud ceiling at 200 feet, and we have unconfirmed reports of hail cell formation on approach." Jake immediately began consulting our navigation charts and calculating distances to alternate airports. The nearest one was about 180 kilometers away, in a direction that would take us away from the frontal system. The problem was we didn't have updated weather information for that area. During the next 15 minutes, the picture continued deteriorating. Other pilots began reporting their experiences. Continuous severe turbulence from 15,000 feet, severe wind shear on final, visibility practically zero at 500 feet. An experienced captain I knew personally and deeply respected reported, "Attempted 2 approaches and diverting to alternate. Conditions impractical for safe operation." That's when I made my first critical decision of the night. "Jake, request clearance to divert to the alternate airport. Let's get out of this area before conditions get even worse." While Jake handled communications with control, I began making mental calculations about our fuel. We had planned the amount needed for the original flight, plus regulatory reserves of 45 minutes, plus an additional 30-minute reserve I always request for night flights. However, significant route deviations and the possibility of having to make multiple approach attempts began making fuel management a real concern. "Captain," Jake said after finishing communications, "Control has approved our request, but informed us that the alternate airport is also being affected by the frontal system, though with less intensity. They have wind 30 degrees at 35 knots gusting to 50 knots, moderate rain and visibility of 1,200 meters. These weren't ideal conditions, but they were still within the operational limits of our Boeing 737-800 and my captain's certification. The problem is these limits assume everything will work perfectly on the first attempt. In reality, adverse weather conditions frequently require multiple approach attempts. At that moment, I did something I'd rarely done in 15 years as captain. I activated the passenger address system to make a detailed announcement about our situation. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Anderson from the flight deck. Due to adverse weather conditions that developed faster than predicted, we're diverting our flight to an alternate airport. This is a standard safety procedure, and while this means a change to our original plans, I want to assure everyone that safety continues to be our absolute priority. The cabin crew will be available to address any questions. We ask that you remain seated with seatbelts fastened, as we may encounter some turbulence during our new route." Lisa called me immediately on the interphone. "Captain, passengers are asking about missed connections and schedules. How should I advise them?" "Tell them the airline will handle all necessary rearrangements once we land," I replied. "Right now our only concern is getting them safely to the ground." As we navigated toward the alternate airport, conditions around us began deteriorating visibly. We were flying on the edge of the frontal system, and I could see lightning flashes through the flight deck windows. The turbulence, which had been non-existent until then, began as light bumps that gradually intensified. If you're enjoying this story, consider subscribing to the Black Box channel. We have dozens of real accounts like this waiting for you. "Jake, turn on the seatbelt sign and request that the cabin be prepared for turbulence," I instructed. Seconds later, the aircraft was hit by an air mass that made us drop about 200 feet instantly, before we recovered altitude. I heard some muffled screams from the passenger cabin. From that point on, flying became intense physical work. Instead of simply monitoring systems and making occasional small adjustments, I had to constantly fight air currents to maintain our trajectory and altitude. My hands were firmly on the controls, making continuous corrections to compensate for wind gusts hitting the aircraft from different directions. Jake was doing excellent work monitoring our instruments and maintaining constant communication with air traffic control, but I could sense the growing tension in his voice. During a particularly violent gust that tilted our aircraft approximately 35 degrees to the left in less than 2 seconds, he gripped his seat armrests tightly and said, "Captain, in almost 3,000 hours of flying, I've never faced turbulence like this." "Neither have I with this intensity, Jake," I replied, fighting the controls to level the aircraft. "But remember our training. The airplane was designed to handle much more than this. Our responsibility is to keep it controlled and follow procedures." Radio communications became a constant stream of alarming information. Other aircraft were reporting increasingly worse conditions: 80-knot gusts on final, zero visibility in rain and hail, runway flooded with severe hydroplaning, approach impossible, diverting to emergency airport. That's when we received the information that really concerned me. "Attention all aircraft. The alternate airport reports deteriorating conditions. Wind now 040 degrees at 45 knots, gusting to 65 knots. Heavy rain, visibility 800 meters and decreasing." What this meant in practical terms was that our safe option was rapidly becoming almost as challenging as our original destination. And what was worse, we only had 2 other alternatives within a 300-kilometer radius, and weather information about them was over an hour old. Jake recalculated our fuel considering the new circumstances. "Captain, with current fuel and considering possible missed approaches, we have margin for 2 attempts at the alternate airport, plus fuel to reach the emergency airport if necessary." 2 attempts. That wasn't much when dealing with severe weather conditions. In normal situations, I always prefer to have margin for at least 3 or 4 attempts, especially on night flights with adverse conditions. During the next 20 minutes, we continued facing turbulence that varied from moderate to severe. The aircraft vibrated constantly, like driving on a cobblestone road at high speed. Alert systems sounded several times: altitude alarms, speed alerts, wind shear warnings. Each alarm required immediate action and absolute precision in the controls. The situation in the passenger cabin was becoming challenging. Lisa informed me that several people were getting airsick due to constant turbulence. Some children were crying, and passengers were visibly nervous. "Captain, would it be possible to make another announcement? People are scared and need to hear your voice." I made another announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we continue navigating through adverse weather conditions, which results in the turbulence we're experiencing. While uncomfortable, our aircraft was designed to withstand conditions much more severe than these. We ask that you keep your seatbelts securely fastened and follow the cabin crew's instructions. We'll be beginning our descent to the alternate airport in approximately 15 minutes." The approach to the alternate airport began at 1:28 a.m., almost 2 hours after our originally scheduled arrival time at the initial destination. Weather conditions at the alternate airport had continued deteriorating, but were still technically within minimum limits for an instrument approach. "Tower, this is our flight requesting updated information on runway conditions and wind," I communicated as we began our descent through thick clouds and continuous turbulence. "Flight, current conditions. Wind 50 degrees at 42 knots gusting to 68 knots. Visibility 600 meters in heavy rain. Cloud ceiling at 300 feet. Wet runway with braking effectiveness reported as poor. We have an aircraft that went around 5 minutes ago, reporting severe wind shear at 400 feet. Jake looked at me with an expression mixing concern and determination. It was the same expression I'd seen in the mirror 20 years ago, during my first really challenging weather situation. "Captain, these conditions are at the absolute limit of our operational minimums." "Yes, they are," I confirmed, "but we're still within limits. We'll make a cautious attempt. If anything doesn't seem right during the approach, we go around immediately. No hesitation, no trying to force a landing." During descent, we faced turbulence that made our 80-ton aircraft rock like a small boat in rough seas. Wind shear alert systems triggered 4 times, forcing us to make constant power and trajectory adjustments. Jake was visibly sweating, but maintained absolute concentration on instruments and communications. At 2,000 feet altitude, we still couldn't see anything but dense clouds and heavy rain beating against the windscreen. The instrument landing systems were working perfectly, but without visual references, we had to rely completely on instruments, something that always makes me slightly uncomfortable in extreme weather conditions. 500 feet, no visual contact, Jake reported. 400 feet, no visual contact. 300 feet, still no visual contact. Captain, we're reaching our decision altitude. The minimum decision altitude for that approach was 250 feet. This meant that if we didn't have visual contact with the runway by reaching that altitude, we'd be required to go around and try again. 250 feet, no visual contact. Maximum power, go around, I announced, pulling the controls up and pushing the throttles completely forward. The engines roared as we climbed again, moving away from ground we knew was dangerously close but couldn't see. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it over the engine noise. This had been our first attempt and it had failed completely. Tower, missed approach completed. Requesting vectors for another approach, I communicated, trying to keep my voice professional despite the tension I felt. Flight, vectors approved for new approach. I inform you that conditions continue deteriorating. Wind now 060 degrees at 48 knots gusting to 75 knots. During the next 15 minutes, while preparing for the second attempt, I briefly discussed our options with Jake. We had fuel for one more attempt there, then we'd have to proceed to the emergency airport, which was 180 kilometers away. The problem was we hadn't had updated weather information about that airport for over an hour. The second approach began at 2:05 a.m. This time conditions seemed slightly better. Turbulence was a bit less intense, and the wind, though still strong, seemed more stable. Jake obsessively monitored every instrument, calling out altitudes, speeds, and trajectory deviations every few seconds. 1,000 feet stable speed on glide path. 800 feet slight deviation right correcting. 500 feet wind gust from the left compensating. 400 feet still no visual contact. 300 feet visual contact with approach lights. Finally, we could see the lights that would guide us to the runway. It was like emerging from a dark cave and seeing sunlight, immense relief after almost half an hour, flying completely on instruments. 250 feet, runway in sight, continuing approach. But that's exactly when things became truly critical. At just 150 feet above ground, a sudden violent crosswind gust hit our aircraft. Within seconds, we were pushed approximately 60 meters off the runway center line. The aircraft banked dramatically to the right, reaching an angle of almost 40 degrees. For a moment, that lasted an eternity, I fought desperately against the controls to keep our aircraft level and aimed at the runway. I could feel the airplane struggling against natural forces, trying to throw it away from our safe trajectory. It was like trying to control a car at high speed on an ice rink. "Maximum power, go round," I shouted, pushing the throttles completely forward, while pulling the yoke up with all the force I could apply. The engines responded instantly, but we still passed dangerously close to the ground. So close I could clearly see runway lights passing beneath us as we climbed again. Jake was pale, but executed all missed approach procedures perfectly, as if he were in a simulator during training. "Tower, second missed approach completed," I communicated, my voice slightly more tense this time. "Requesting vectors to the emergency airport." There was a pause of a few seconds before the tower responded. "Flight, cleared direct to emergency airport. We report that weather conditions there are significantly better. Wind 090 degrees at 25 knots. Visibility 3,000 meters. No precipitation." That was exactly what we needed to hear. But now we faced a different and potentially more serious problem. Fuel. Jake redid his calculations as we navigated toward the emergency airport. "Captain, considering remaining distance, current consumption, and required reserves, we'll arrive at the emergency airport with approximately 18 minutes of fuel remaining. This assumes we won't encounter significant headwinds and that we'll manage to land on the first attempt." 18 minutes. In commercial aviation, that's an extremely small margin. Ideally, we'd have at least 30 minutes of fuel remaining when landing, but 18 minutes was still technically within minimum safety limits, as long as everything went perfectly. Communicating minimum fuel situation to tower, Jake said, using the standard code that alerts controllers we're in a situation requiring priority, but isn't yet a declared emergency. The next 35 minutes were the longest of my career. Every minute that passed meant less safety margin. We optimized our flight altitude for maximum efficiency, reduced engine power to the minimum needed to maintain our speed, and shut off all non-essential systems to save every ounce of fuel possible. Jake calculated and recalculated our consumption every 3 minutes. Captain, consumption still within predicted range. Current estimate, 16 minutes of fuel remaining when touching the runway. 16 minutes. The margin was getting smaller and smaller, but was still technically sufficient. What worried me was that these estimates assumed perfect conditions, and in aviation things are rarely perfect. During that flight to the emergency airport, I had time to reflect on all the decisions I'd made during the night. Had I made the right choices? Should I have decided to divert earlier? Should I have attempted a third approach at the alternate airport? These questions ran through my mind, but I knew this wasn't the time for doubts. I needed to maintain total focus on the current situation. At 2:52 a.m., we finally received the best news of the night. Flight, you're 50 kilometers from the emergency airport. Current conditions, wind 110 degrees at 22 knots, unlimited visibility, clear skies, dry runway. You're cleared for direct approach. Clear skies, dry runway, moderate stable wind. After almost 4 hours fighting adverse weather conditions, we'd finally have an approach in normal conditions. The final approach to the emergency airport was like waking up from a nightmare. After hours fighting severe turbulence, intense wind, and almost zero visibility, suddenly we were flying in normal nighttime conditions. We could see city lights kilometers away. Turbulence had completely disappeared, and the aircraft responded smoothly to controls. "What a difference," Jake murmured, visibly more relaxed for the first time in hours. "It's like we came out of the inside of a hurricane." "That's exactly what happened," I replied. "We flew on the edge of that frontal system for almost 2 hours. Now we're in a completely different air mass." The approach was textbook perfect. We could see the runway from more than 20 kilometers away. The descent path was stable and smooth, and for the first time that night, I didn't need to make constant control corrections. It was the type of approach we do hundreds of times per year. Routine, controlled, predictable. When the main wheels touched the runway at 3:07 a.m., I felt a type of relief I'd never experienced before in 15 years as captain. It wasn't just relief from a successful landing after challenging conditions. It was the profound relief of knowing all 165 people aboard were finally safe on the ground. The landing was smooth as silk. During taxi procedures to the parking position, Jake checked our fuel indicators one last time. "Captain, fuel remaining. 14 minutes of flight." 14 minutes. We'd landed with one of the smallest fuel margins of my career, but still within safety limits. It was a margin small enough to make my heart race, but large enough to confirm that all our decisions during the night had been appropriate. During deplaning, something happened I'll never forget. Passenger after passenger approached me to thank me personally. An elderly lady held my hand and said, "Captain, when I heard your voice on the intercom, always calm and confident, I knew we were in good hands." A businessman commented, "I work in crisis management at my company, and I recognize professional competence when I see it. Thank you for bringing us home." But the comment that touched me most came from a girl about 10 years old, accompanied by her mother. She approached shyly and said, "Pilot, are you brave like superheroes?" Her mother smiled and explained, "She got scared during the turbulence, but when you spoke over the intercom, she said your voice made her feel safe." I knelt down to the girl's height and replied, "I'm not a superhero. I'm just someone who studied a lot and practiced a lot to be able to take people like you safely through the skies. What we did tonight was teamwork. Me, Jake, the cabin crew, and even you passengers, following our instructions." The following days were ones of intense reflection and analysis. It's a process I follow religiously after any flight presenting challenges beyond the ordinary. I reviewed every decision made, every procedure followed, every communication conducted. I spoke with meteorologists to better understand how that frontal system had behaved so differently from predictions. I discussed the case with other experienced captains, seeking different perspectives and additional lessons. The first major lesson was about the importance of always keeping multiple options open. Throughout the entire night, we never fixated on a single alternative. When the original destination became impractical, we immediately considered the alternate airport. When this also proved too challenging, we had the emergency airport as backup. This mental flexibility is crucial in adverse situations. The second lesson was about fuel resource management in non-standard situations. Although we'd landed with a small margin, all our diversion decisions were based on precise and conservative calculations. The key was constantly recalculating our situation as circumstances changed, always maintaining a safety margin. The third lesson was about teamwork under pressure. Jake, despite his limited experience in critical situations, was fundamental to the operation's success. His meticulous attention to instruments, precise communications with air traffic control, and perfect execution of all procedures allowed me to concentrate totally on flying the aircraft. 2 weeks after that flight, I received a letter that deeply moved me. It was from Dr. Jennifer Thompson, one of the passengers that night. She was a medical doctor specializing in medical emergencies and was returning from an international conference on hospital crisis management. Her letter said, "Captain Anderson, as a professional who deals daily with life or death situations, I recognize technical competence and leadership under pressure when I see it. During those hours of turbulence and uncertainty, your calm presence and clear decisions transmitted confidence to us. More than that, you inspired me to be a better professional. I understood that regardless of our work area, our patients, whether they're passengers on an airplane or people in an emergency room, depend on our calmness, preparation, and ability to make correct decisions when everything is at stake." Jake and I continued flying together regularly after that night. Our shared baptism by fire created a professional partnership based on mutual trust and respect. He evolved quickly as a pilot, and today is one of the airline's most competent first officers. We frequently joke about our first adventure, but we both know that experience changed us as professionals. That night's experience also led me to become more intensely involved in training programs for young pilots. I began conducting seminars on weather crisis management, decision-making under pressure, and flight deck leadership. Using that experience to help other pilots prepare for similar situations gave additional meaning to everything we experienced that Tuesday in November. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe to the Black Box channel. We have dozens of other fascinating tales from the skies. Today, 5 years after that November night, I continue flying regularly, but also dedicate significant time to training other pilots and operational safety analysis. That experience taught me that every flight, no matter how routine it might seem, carries the potential to become extraordinary, and that our preparation must always be equal to that possibility. One of the most significant changes in my professional routine was adopting more extensive and detailed weather briefings. Now, in addition to standard information, I always request trend analyses, check developing frontal systems, and maintain more frequent communication with meteorologists during night flights or periods of atmospheric instability. Commercial aviation has evolved tremendously in recent decades and continues evolving. Our aircraft are safer, our weather systems are more precise, our training procedures are more comprehensive, and our understanding of human factors in critical situations is more sophisticated. However, some things will never change. The importance of human judgment, the need for effective teamwork, and the fundamental responsibility to place safety above any other consideration. For young pilots who might be listening to this story, I want to leave some reflections based not only on that specific night, but on 2 decades of commercial aviation career. First, never stop learning and questioning. Every flight, every situation, every interaction with other professionals is a growth opportunity. Second, develop solid relationships with colleagues from all areas: meteorologists, air traffic controllers, mechanics, flight attendants. Aviation is fundamentally a collaborative activity. For the general public, I hope this story illustrates the level of preparation, training, and dedication behind every commercial flight. When you board an aircraft, you're entrusting your lives to professionals who spent years preparing to face not only routine situations, but also those extraordinary ones we hope never to need in practice. That unexpected storm taught me that the difference between a competent pilot and an exceptional pilot isn't in the absence of challenging situations, but in how we respond to them. It's not about never feeling fear or uncertainty, but about maintaining functionality and clear judgment despite these natural emotions. It's about accepting the responsibility our profession carries and always being prepared to honor it. Today, whenever I see stormy cloud formations on the horizon or receive adverse weather reports, I remember that night, not with anxiety or apprehension, but with respect for nature and confidence in my preparation. Every challenging experience we overcome makes us more prepared for the next one, creating a cycle of professional growth that benefits not only ourselves, but everyone who will fly with us in the future. If there's a message I want to leave with this story, it's that no matter what your profession or responsibility, there will always be moments that test your limits and your ability to make decisions under pressure. What defines us isn't those moments themselves, but how we react to them and what we learn from them. And just as that storm eventually passed and gave way to clear skies, all the difficulties we face are temporary. If you've been through situations where you had to make difficult decisions under extreme pressure, share your story in the comments. And if you want to continue hearing more fascinating tales from the skies, subscribe to the Black Box channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories.